Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced, subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech, TV, and podcast platforms. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world is overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers in the movements for social justice, and we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, Margaret Kwateng joins us. She is the campaign director at Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, where she shepherded the development of GGJ's first national campaign, the People's Care Agenda. It's a campaign that seeks to both defend communities from attacks and build caring alternatives. Prior to joining GGJ, Margaret worked for years as a community and labor organizer in working class communities of color and with rank-and-file nurses. Welcome to the program, Margaret.
Thank you so much for having me, Sonali.
So how do you summarize what your organization is before we even get into what it does? Because as the name suggests, it is an alliance. That means I gathered that it's essentially a coalition of numerous organizations. If so, who are these organizations? What defines Grassroots Global Justice Alliance?
Yeah, absolutely. So Grassroots Global Justice Alliance is an alliance of around 65 community grassroots organizations. And so by grassroots, I mean organizations that are made up of everyday poor and working class people, predominantly people of color, who are brought into groups, by conversations on the bus, at school, on the streets, and then sort of like introduced into community efforts that are around improving the conditions. And the groups that are in Grassroots Global Justice Alliance are all over the country, including in the territories, so in like Puerto Rico and Guam, and are fighting on a whole host of issues, from workers' rights to reproductive justice, to migrant rights. But the thing that's really connecting them in Grassroots Global Justice Alliance is this understanding and desire to be in deep relationship with social movements in other parts of the world. Um, yeah, so that's a little about who is in our base, and then I'm happy to talk about the work that we do.
Yeah, so from looking through GGJ's website, the issues seem to span very sort of widely from things around Venezuela and the United Nations Climate Conference down to what's happening right here in the United States and the anti-immigrant crackdown. So what are the through lines that connect up these issues? I mean, the word justice, of course, summarizes it, but justice is very large. It's a huge, huge word, right? So narrow it down for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like I think I was beginning to name, I think that the world is really clear on the role of the United States in sort of dictating the rules and the conditions under which almost everybody else lives. And I think we're seeing that to the extreme right now, with the kidnapping of Maduro, Venezuela's president, and then the bombings that happened in Nigeria over Christmas. That this role of the United States is kind of an imperial power, almost acting as a colonial power, that I think are we see that as like such a central part of the work that is like the through line. Um, and then I think how that then plays out in all of the different areas of work is that we see like militarism, and the role of not just the US military abroad, the war abroad, but also how that's connected to the war at home as a central issue. So thinking about the militarization we're seeing of ICE right now, of the police, in prisons, that type of like war-centered, weapon-centered kind of economy of death is a central part of what we're fighting against. And then I think on the other side of that is what we're fighting for. So we talk a lot about the idea of grassroots feminism. So that being a feminism that's actually coming from, poor and working class women and gender expansive folks around the globe, and that's about, being pro peace, around being pro the climate, that's around, I guess, taking care of one another. So understanding that, again, the policies that we have here in the United States impact people globally, and that the ways in which we are spending money right now that are often centered in this kind of war-based economy could alternatively be going toward more caring policies that are life-centered, and about taking care of both folks right here in the United States context, but also about having more care for the climate and other aspects of our economy that impact the world.
Right. And so I think that sort of leads naturally into this people's care agenda that I'd mentioned that you worked on. And, we've seen some similar things being articulated in smaller organizations here in the United States. This idea of, divest, invest, divest from the things that don't work for us or that just cause harm, and invest in the things that actually result in human well-being. Tell me about the People's Care Agenda.
Yeah, so the People's Care Agenda was developed over a couple of years with our members, and it's sort of part one of a longer term agenda that's around divesting from the military budget in the United States, and investing in sort of non-militarized responses to climate disaster, knowing that currently we really only have the National Guard, that there's not a unified response to climate disaster. And so in sort of fighting for that long-term agenda and recognizing the moment that we're in with all of the attacks that are happening from the current administration, we realize that folks who are fighting against militarism in the long term are going to need to be fighting against things like ICE in this current moment, the militarization of ICE, things like the invasion of the National Guard, and fighting to like build out, yeah, protections locally, whether that's sort of sanctuary policies, or that's support for mutual aid projects, that the People's Care Agenda is trying to put forward like a vision for what's necessary to protect our communities in this time, while also offering some policy recommendations and strategies for how to resist.
So, how does Grassroots Global Justice Alliance set about trying to achieve the goals, realizing the People's Care Agenda? Being a coalition, being an alliance of dozens of smaller organizations. Do the organizations come together to agree on certain steps, or do you work through the electoral process or outside it, a local government or no government at all, and more around community to community mutual aid efforts? What do the practical on the ground steps look like towards realizing this better world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we definitely have a kind of multi-pronged approach, given what you're saying, that the organizations in Grassroots Global Justice Alliance work on a whole host of issues. So I think on one hand, we are doing like the political education and development that is around, understanding the world, like how the systems that we're up against are interconnected, given that folks are working on different issues, as well as trying to like build uh, those types of coalitions or alliances at the local level or the regional level, where they are able to take up sort of shared, yeah, policy efforts or shared electoral efforts, or shared like corporate campaigns that are kind of like challenging this hyper militarization or building out efforts toward larger community care, like expanding paid family leave. Um, the other piece is, I mean, I think I started to name it there, but um, some of the concrete steps I think are around people taking up shared tactics, shared messaging that's trying to kind of like shift the uh, what we often call as the Overton window, like the window of what we think is possible in policy in any given moment. Um, and then to also take up work around um, budget fights, where they are actively debating what types of things get invested in and what things get divested from, to take up electoral fights, where folks can be running on the People's Care Agenda platform as a part of what they're putting forward, and then in terms of legislative efforts. So we have groups, for example, that are working on, expanding sanctuary or trying to kill policies that will, further uh, harm, immigrants and other folks in this time.
What about the ways in which the organizing very much seems to, at least what Grassroots Global Justice Alliance gives through its website, seems quite centered on racial justice. And let's talk a little bit about that. Why is that important? How does GGJ's work unite racial justice agendas around the world, making sort of racial justice a global issue?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it sort of goes back to how we view the history of the economy that we're living in the United States, that this idea of kind of how capitalism played out here, and by that I mean like an economy that is, entirely centered on growth, that is entirely centered on sort of extraction just for the increased profit. Um, and knowing that that was so tied to the transatlantic slave trade and to the dispossession of land, and the genocide that happened against indigenous peoples here. So I think having that as like our baseline, we know that racial justice needs to be such a critical part of any agenda that we put forward. And when we're organizing with folks globally, we often are trying to connect with communities that have been, dispossessed of land and are trying to win that back, or that have been experiencing, the impacts of white supremacy. And so I think that then in terms of how we're organizing around things like climate reparations, or things, or even things like thinking about who is actually at the center of a policy that's around care workers, that it's having that background and that knowledge, that often care workers are women of color in this country, and that often, folks who are heads of households, and are like women of color in this country. And so I think some of those, so I think some of the ways in which we're able to connect those in our organizing work has to do with just kind of who we started the conversation with.
Right. And then there's also this idea of grassroots feminism and building a feminist economy that seems to be a strong theme for Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. Tell me a little bit about what that means. I mean, some people listening to this idea or hearing this term feminist economy for the first time might misunderstand it. And of course, these days there's so much fear and, pearl clutching over anything that involves sort of feminizing the world. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there are many elements of it. So one, is that, right, there's this whole undercurrent or undergirding of labor that like upholds the rest of our society, and that's often reproductive labor, that is taking care of children, that is educating children, that is caring for the sick and the elderly. And I think a part of a feminist economy is like visibilizing and socializing that labor. Um, there's also elements that are around how we relate to the earth. So I think seeing ourselves as needing to be in a better relationship to the earth, one that is not extractive in nature, which we don't see as a feminist relationship to the earth, one that is centered on care and on life. So when we're looking at policies and when we're looking at how to structure our society and our systems, that it is more about what will be protecting life, what will be enshrining, what will be cherishing life. And yeah, and so I think that that's a big part of how we see a feminist economy, that it needs to be anti-racist in nature, that it needs to be regenerative in nature, that it is about yeah, sort of like having care at the center and recognizing and bringing into light and to the for all of the yeah, all of the labor that is necessary for uh, a healthy society.
Margaret, what are the biggest challenges that GGJ faces in achieving its goals, both physical and cultural? I think the physical ones are the really obvious ones, right? Rising authoritarianism, etc. But articulate those for us, in terms of what it is that you face when carrying out your agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Rising authoritarianism is, um, we've identified as being sort of like the primary roadblock in this time, and that's because it has, effectively it has um, an anti-feminist agenda across the board, right? It's not about it's about extraction. It's about waging war. And it is not about, caring for broad swaths of our society, for the most vulnerable, for children, for our gender expansive folks, for LGBTQ community folks. That yeah. So I guess just to name, reiterate that rising authoritarianism is a big part of it. And then I think there are of um, pieces of society that are a part of, I think, how rising authoritarianism ended up um, in in control, that have been consistent roadblocks over the years. So things like the weapons industry and lobby, or the fossil fuel industry and lobby. We definitely see the like climate crisis as one of the unifying issues that we all are facing in these times, and will be facing in the coming decades. And so um, the fact that we've engaged in like the United Nations conference on climate change is because we see addressing the climate crisis as a central part of any movement. And so the fossil fuel industry has been a big part of sowing confusion around what it means to fight for climate justice.
Right. I mean, it's
Uh,
not just rising authoritarianism, but of course, the corporatization of the economy, which is not a new thing. It's many, many, many decades in the making. And yeah, it wraps up. Those two forces work hand in hand, right? Authoritarianism and corporatization, predatory capitalism, global capitalism work hand in hand. One feeds the other, and together they destroy the climate, they destroy the rights of people, and impact the most vulnerable. So I'm wondering, Margaret, if you can articulate what the narrative strategy, explain that the narrative strategy that Grassroots Global Justice Alliance adopts, if any, to kind of get the buy-in of the public, right? The broad public. Obviously, our member organizations have this common agenda, but we need the whole world, or as many people as possible, like-minded people, to be part of this work. So how do you convince them?
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, because I think one of the the other challenges that's maybe cultural in this time is, right, that I think the pandemic accelerated this sort of, rising, always embedded like level of individualism, isolation, and yeah, folks, with the rise of social media kind of being in their homes and not necessarily in these third spaces and community spaces. So I think around narrative, one of the ways in which we're trying to build that is, I mean, I think is by sharing out about the work of our members, whether it's on these delegations where they are connecting with people globally who are facing similar conditions, so that folks feel seen in the conditions that they face every day. Um, to then like also trying to put forward um, media that's around the vision we want to see. So people being able to tell their stories of when they've been able to win their campaigns or build out communities, expand the reach of their organizations, win policies that actually have everyday material impacts on people's lives. That that I think like being able to have folks to tell that fight and that struggle in their own words is a part of how we're trying to build out the narrative of like what it is we want to see and how it is that we get there. And I think the last piece around this is like it one of the tendencies I think of social justice movements can be to like focus on all the things we don't want to see. We've definitely been guilty of that, of being, saying like no war and no warming and, sexism and no homophobia, and not always saying what it is that we're trying to fight, um,
Right. Yeah,
including
that's
like,
such a critical issue, and I think that's one that the left broadly has started to learn in the last few years, that it's so important for us to start articulating what it is that we want to see in the world rather than everything that's wrong with it, because we've done a good job at explaining that part of it, right?
absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the things that moves people into action is like the feeling that there's hope that the world can change and and that if they take action, right, that it is necessary for them to be a part of the fight to do that. That sort of like protagonism, that feeling of I am a part of telling this story, it is a critical piece of what um we're needing for folks to then step out into the streets to protect their neighbors, to join organizations.
So, how do you fit? How does Grassroots Global Justice Alliance fit within the broader context of the social justice universe? Who do you see as your natural allies, either here in the United States or abroad?
Yeah. So I guess the folks in our immediate sort of circle and vicinity are other, I think grassroots organizations and alliances that work on other, some of the other sets of issues that we don't necessarily have as much focus on, such as right to city and the housing work that they're predominantly doing, or the Climate Justice Alliance, who's been carrying forward a lot of the climate work, and the Indigenous Environmental Network, who we've been close to over the years. And then I think one layer out from that, we've been a part of many efforts at building what we often call the bigger we. So um, the set of forces that we think are going to be important in pushing back on authoritarianism, including a bunch of organizations in the kind of progressive left, as well as some organizations that see themselves as opposed to authoritarianism, including, I think, some of the forces that are in labor, and other institutions, think tanks, et cetera, that are trying to figure out how to address this moment. Um, so I think those are some of our natural allies, at least in this context. And then I think globally, we've been in long-term relationship with organizations like La Via Campesina or the World March of Women, or the movement of people affected by dams, that those movements have sort of like many tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands of people that have been backing them over decades. And I think a lot of the strength that we try to draw from is from having gotten to see and engage with people who know what it's like to be in the streets with thousands of people at your back, uh, you know, moving forward this call and this fight for a care-centered economy.
How can organizations join the alliance? I mean, normally I would ask the question of how can individuals join an organization, but since yours is an alliance of organizations, I imagine that you are open to allowing new orgs to join and to, increase your strength. There's always strength in numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is an application that is on our website, and it's also possible to sign up for our listserv on our website, where we put out calls to action, so folks are able to join when there are local actions led by member organizations in their area. And then I do encourage folks to look up the organizations that are a part of GGJ, and reach out to them around volunteer opportunities, if not to join them as a member.
And give out that website.
ggjalliance.org.
And that's ggjalliance.org for the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. Margaret, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
My guest has been Margaret Kwateng, the campaign director for the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, where she shepherded the People's Care Agenda. This is Rising Up for Justice, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of a new weekly half-hour series that you've just been watching and listening to, exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.